All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about why I don't think we have enough evidence we went to the moon to say confidently that we went to the moon. It's called the black box problem. So here we go. So the task at hand, imagine that this is a criminal prosecution and it is my job to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Neil Armstrong, not stuff, went to the moon. So this is going to be a burden of proof type of presentation where I assert that the evidence NASA has provided has not rose to the burden of proof, has not met that burden of proof to prove the claim that a human, not stuff, went to the moon. And I make a very clear distinction between proving that stuff went to the moon and proving that a human being went to the moon and came back. So just imagine throughout this presentation that I am a criminal prosecutor and it is my job to prove to a jury beyond reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard of evidence, that Neil Armstrong, a specific person, went to the moon. So I'm using that burden of proof, the highest burden, the highest quality of evidence, because if we can chip away at it there, it's a lot easier to sort of chip away at it later down the road. So if I can say that, yeah, it's not beyond reasonable doubt, then we have some amount of doubt to play with in the future. So I'm just trying to make God bleed, so to speak. So if you're familiar with law, with criminal law, you might know what discovery means. Discovery basically just means all of the evidence that both prosecution and defense has to work with, that they both can see, that they can both manipulate. So this certainly isn't all the evidence, but these are the main categories of evidence for the moon landing. First, we have a ton of videos and photos that there's a lot of speculation about. Some people have issues with it, but I'm not really going to be talking about the specifics of any specific photo or video. This is about burden of proof, putting the onus on NASA to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a certain thing happened. But that's in Discovery, a lot of photos and videos. We have a ton of supposed moon rocks in Discovery that are supposedly, there's a claim that they came from the lunar surface. We have reports, third-party reports of reflectors on the moon. People can point lasers at the moon and have stuff reflect back. And that's supposed to be from the location of the moon landing. And the idea is that you can do that in that particular place. You couldn't do it before the moon landing, and you can do it after. At least that's the claim. And then we also have eyewitness testimony from Mr. Armstrong, from Neil Armstrong and others saying that they went to the moon. But you know, that doesn't really rise to the burden of proof. And then we have a ton of stuff designed to go to the moon. We have a rocket that went into orbit, and we have stuff that went around the moon that other people confirmed, that other countries confirmed, not with radar, but with systems similar to radar. And then we have a ton of people who designed stuff to land on the moon, and we have a ton of stuff that was tested for going to the moon. So that's what we have in Discovery. If there's something that I missed, let me know, but I think those are the primary categories of evidence. So these are the three things that we need to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Number one, that Neil Armstrong, here to have to refer to as NA for brevity, was on the rocket when it launched. We also need to prove that the rocket, and there's an asterisk there indicating that by rocket I mean any part or stage of the original launch vehicle. So the second thing we need to prove is that the rocket went into orbit around the moon with Neil Armstrong inside. The third thing we need to prove beyond reasonable doubt is that the rocket landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong inside. So those are the three things we need to prove in order to find Neil Armstrong guilty of going to the moon. So here's the first black box problem, and there's going to be a diagram that kind of illustrates this later. The launch complex. When Neil Armstrong goes towards the launch complex, the only eyes we have on him after that is just the video cameras. No person from NASA, except for a very small amount of people, had eyes on that. We don't know where he actually went. It's a black box. We can't see it. We can't investigate it. We don't have like third-party camera footage, security camera footage that we can pull up and look at. This is all just steps. This is all just stuff that NASA gave us. It's a black box. We can't investigate it. So I know that NA approached the launch tower, but after that he goes into a black box. It's a very small amount of people who were actually there, eyewitnesses to whether he did or did not get on the rocket and stay on the rocket when it launched, or up until the point when it launched. We don't know. It's a black box. It cannot be investigated. So this makes it extremely difficult to prove that that Neil Armstrong was in the rocket when it launched. It's a black box. We can't investigate it. We don't know. Not beyond reasonable doubt. Black box problem number 2, the blip. And I say blip because that's what it's called on radar. I know the system you would use to track these objects in orbit is not radar, I don't think, but I'm calling it a blip because that's just the vocabulary that I have. So the next problem is that I have no idea what is or is not inside the blip going around the moon. We have reports from other countries that they tracked something going from LEO, low Earth orbit, to lunar orbit. But we don't know what that blip is. It's just a blip. It's just a dot on a radar screen. We don't know what or who might have been inside that. We have no idea. It's just a blip. We can't investigate it. It's just somebody said in other countries that there was a blip on radar that went in this direction, but we can't investigate what was or was not inside of it, that blip, what that blip was. So we're certainly not rising to the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. This makes it extremely difficult to prove that Neil Armstrong was in the blip when it was in orbit around the moon. Black box problem number 3, lunar orbit. This is another black box. The only evidence we have that our blip, not some other blip, went to the moon's surface is that stuff went to the moon at some point in time, possibly, probably, and that stuff might have come back from the moon at some point in time. So, like, we have one black box inside of another black box inside of another black box. And I'll go to the diagram now. So, over on the left, we have a really big container full of all the stuff that NASA and the public can see. So, like, all the hardware that's still around, the moon rocks, all this stuff that we can see today. Like, we can go up and see the remaining Saturn V vehicle, and we can see all this hardware. People have stuff from this program inside their homes, and we have all the engineers, we have all the designers, all the builders, all of the launch hardware. That's not the stuff that helps us prove whether Neil Armstrong physically went to the moon. It just proves that there was a program that did a lot of stuff that was supposed to go to the moon. And we'll talk about the moon rocks later. But on the right, we have 3 black squares. Those are the black boxes. The one on the left, the launch complex on launch day, that's a bigger black box because it's easier to prove that Neil Armstrong actually did go on the rocket. But then when we go to the blip black box, it's significantly more difficult to prove what was or was not inside that blip. It's a lot more difficult. So it's a black box inside of a black box. We can't investigate it. It is impossible to investigate what did or didn't happen inside that launch complex at that particular time in history. It is impossible to investigate what that blip was, who was inside of it, what was inside of it, if anything was inside of it. And then when we go to the next black box, which is within 2 other black boxes, that's lunar orbit. We have no idea. It is impossible to investigate that. If this were a criminal prosecution, it would be like, there's no point in this case. It's impossible to investigate. We can't prove anything beyond reasonable doubt. It's a black box inside of black box inside a black box. We have no idea. So going back to the lunar orbit slide, this makes it extremely difficult to prove that the rocket ever went to the moon in the first place, never mind whether Neil Armstrong was in it, when or if it went to the moon. So we have Neil Armstrong going to the launch complex, and then he's going into a black box. Then he supposedly goes into another black box that we can't investigate. And then that box supposedly goes to another black box that we can't investigate. He's inside of 3 black boxes that are not investigatable. So that's a massive problem if we want to prove beyond reasonable doubt. So what I am saying that it is impossible to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Neil Armstrong, not stuff, committed the crime of going to the surface of the moon. We have a lot of evidence that people built a ton of stuff to go to the moon, that basically everyone at NASA thought that Neil Armstrong went to the moon. I'm not saying that 99.99% of NASA lied. I'm not saying that stuff wasn't launched. I'm not saying that, or I am saying that stuff went around the moon, that stuff was launched. Let's get rid of the double negative. That stuff probably ended up on the moon. But what I'm not saying is I'm not saying that we did not go to the moon. I'm not saying that we did go to the moon. What I am saying is it is impossible to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Neil Armstrong, not just stuff, launched, that Neil Armstrong, not just stuff, went into lunar orbit, and that Neil Armstrong, not just stuff, ended up on the lunar surface. So I'm not making a big, bold claim here. I'm just saying that the evidence that NASA has provided has not risen to the burden of proof necessary to prove this beyond reasonable doubt. We don't know. It's too many unknowns. We cannot investigate. So this is what I would need to assert with a reasonable degree of confidence, beyond reasonable doubt, that a human being did in fact go to the moon. An investigator or rover would have to go to the surface of the moon and document signs of human activity, not signs of generic stuff. That's how every other investigation works. If you want to say that someone broke into your house, you have to send an investigator to go into your house and look for evidence. You can't investigate that from China. You can't investigate that from the moon. You have to go there and look for evidence of human activity. And we can do that. We can send a rover there. This is not an impossible, absurd claim, an impossible, absurd request. I'm saying you need to send a rover there and document signs of human activity, because that's how you have to investigate. If we can go over there and investigate and see that yes, there is signs of human activity, and if that human activity is consistent with the video footage, then we can reasonably assert beyond reasonable doubt that there was human activity there because we have direct evidence of it. And, there is circumstantial evidence that can build cases, but in this case, we have way too many black boxes, things that we can't investigate. So here are some of the counter arguments that people give. People say we know that Neil Armstrong, not stuff, went to the moon because of the moon rocks that we didn't have sample collection rovers for at the time. I'm trying to steelman that argument by saying that people would say that you can say that we got rocks from a rover. Well, we didn't have rovers, so it had to have been people. But unfortunately, the reason that doesn't really work is because we have precisely 0 confirmed lunar samples to compare the evidence to. When we want to prove that this evidence is consistent with a certain thing, we have to show that it's similar enough to a confirmed sample in order to make that claim, but we don't have any confirmed samples. So the court doesn't know how lunar samples should test in a lab. We don't have confirmed samples, so we don't know what we're doing. Like, you cannot assert beyond reasonable doubt that these lunar rocks must be lunar rocks if you have no confirmed lunar rocks to test them against. That's not how science works. That's not how evidence works. Counterargument number 2 is the parallel shadows. So people say that that the video footage must have been filmed on the moon because of the parallel shadows. You can't reproduce that in a studio. So it must have been done on the lunar surface. But at the same time, you actually can do that with uneven surfaces. And the irony of this is that when like conspiracy theory people say that the footage must have been faked because there are diverging shadows, the rebuttal to that is that you can easily do diverging shadows on the surface of the moon with uneven surfaces. But they don't apply that to their own claim that says that because there are non-diverging shadows or parallel shadows, it must have been done on the surface of the moon. But the issue with that is it goes both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can reproduce these in a studio, these parallel shadows, these non-diverging shadows with uneven surfaces. Just go the other way. And also this can also be done outside on Earth because we have a sun as well on a cloudless day. So my verdict on the case as the prosecutor is that I cannot bring this case. There's no way I can argue this. Neil Armstrong is not guilty of going to the moon. We have no idea what actually happened. It's impossible to assert with any useful amount of confidence that we know that a human being, not stuff, went to the surface of the moon. Remember, this isn't because we poked holes in NASA's claim. It's because NASA's evidence does not meet the burden of proof. It can't. There are far too many black boxes that are impossible to see inside of. The only way we can properly investigate this claim is by investigating the surface of the moon and the location where they said they went. This can be done by sending a rover to that location to look for signs of human activity. So that is my